All right, well, welcome to week number 3 of MPA 540. For this week, we're going to focus on a couple of different topics. One topic we'll focus on is position management, and the other topic is employee engagement. Again, I'll try and make this video as brief as I possibly can and just hit some of the highlights of the major topics that we're going to be talking about in the course this week. So let's start with position management. Position management is a classification system. And it's a classification system that we use for the primary reason of trying to compare positions to each other for the eventual purpose of control and then compensation. When we put together a position management system, we are creating that system based primarily on things such as a job analysis and a job evaluation. And we'll spend time in this video talking about how you do a job analysis, how you do job evaluations, and the primary distinction between those two types of activities. There are three primary types of personnel strategies that can be used: the election, the appointment, and a rule-based selection process. The election process is your basic deliberative democracy, a representative form of government where we elect our representatives, we elect our policymakers to do their work on the political side of the politics administration type of dichotomy. Appointment, we have a system of appointment in our current merit-based system in that the top level leaders, our directors and our secretaries of our agencies and our departments, are appointed by elected officials. The problem with appointments by elected officials, we saw that very clearly back in the era of spoils and the era of patronage. Appointment was used by political parties and by elected officials to dole out as rewards for support in elections. To the victor go the spoils. And a lot of those abuses of the appointment system in the era of spoils then led us, as we had talked about previously, to our current era, which is the era of merit. Era of merit is predicated upon rules-based selection of employees. Whenever we have a merit-based system, we're not only selecting people based upon merit, based upon their qualifications, but we're also controlling and managing the positions within our organization based upon the content of those positions, what's being done on a daily basis, the essential functions of those positions. So in our era of merit, we have several pieces of legislation and several initiatives that have really contributed to this position classification system of position management. A few of them are: in 1853, Congress passed legislation to establish 4 major job classes with appropriate salary ranges. That's kind of our first real foray into creating what we now know as the general schedule at the federal level, our first real foray into position management, position classification. The problem was that the legislation was usually ignored, and so it didn't really have any major impact. We have a Classification Act in 1923. So this is several years after the Pendleton Act we talked about last week in 1883. This Classification Act, we use scientific management to set up a rational position management system. Under this rational position management system, we analyze and manage positions rather than individuals. So we are classifying the position, not the individual incumbent within that position. We classify positions based upon their job duties and their job responsibilities, and we could distinguish between different jobs based upon those characteristics of duties and responsibilities. Qualifications would be a critical factor in determining classification status, and so we had to compare our positions and classify our positions also based upon the qualifications for being in that position. And then once someone had a position that was classified in one job class, that then meant that they were qualified for all other positions within that class as well. Because ostensibly, all these positions that are in the same job class ostensibly are going to have the same requirements, the same job duties, essential functions, and qualifications. As we discussed last week, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 addressed gender discrimination in pay, was intended to try and make sure that we were paying people equal pay for equal work. In last week's video, we spent a good bit of time talking about the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978 that also had a profound impact upon our position management, position classification system at the federal level of government. We talked about the Civil Service Reform Act as creating all these different institutions, such as the Office of Personnel Management, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Office of Special Counsel, the Federal Labor Relations Authority, and the Senior Executive Service. And the attempt again was to provide protections for merit-based hiring and merit-based evaluation and merit-based retention of employees. The problem with the Civil Service Reform Act is, again, you're overlaying rules and requirements on top of rules and requirements, which can make the HR process much more protracted and much more complicated in nature. So when we are managing positions and creating a position classification system, one of the first pieces of information we need is we need to know what each job does and the level of responsibility and quantity of work and type of work being done in each one of our different positions. This is where a job analysis is very important. In a job analysis, we will take each individual job or each individual position within our organization, and we will deconstruct that position into its component elements. So what are the duties of the job? What major work functions are accomplished in this job? How much, what quantity of work is being done in that job? What type of level of responsibility is necessary for the incumbent in that position, which will show us the independence of that position within the hierarchy of the organization. Other things we look at when we do a job analysis: job specialization, the narrowing of the job responsibilities. How is this job different than other jobs within the organization? Process management, looking at where this position fits in terms of the processes of the organization, re-engineering of those processes when needed, job enlargement, which is increasing the scope of the job by extending the range of duties and responsibilities. Job enlargement without the acquiescence of the incumbent in that job can certainly be problematic, and that could lead to problems with motivation of that employee. That's why instead of job enlargement, we hope that we engage in what's called job enrichment. This is something that comes from organization theorists such as Douglas McGregor and Chris Argyris, who would argue that in job enrichment, yes, we are enlarging the job by increasing its functions, but we are doing so in concert with the incumbent in that position, so that that incumbent in that position has the opportunity to help craft the job duties in order to help develop the skills that they want to develop as a human resource. That's the difference between job enrichment and merely just unilaterally enlarging job functions. Job rotation is another concept here with job analysis, in that since we have all these different discrete and different jobs, it's important that we cross-train our personnel. By cross-training our personnel, you can then allow for a system of job rotation where people can do other jobs. And by doing other jobs, they can see how then all these different positions within the organization work together and cooperate together to achieve the goals and the objectives and the mission of that organization. So how do we do a job analysis? Again, this deconstruction of each individual job, each individual position within our organization. One way we do a job analysis is through this use of archival data. So we can go back and we can review the position descriptions and previous job analyses that have been done, previous performance appraisals that have been done, training materials, work manuals, examples of work products that have been created by incumbents in that position, and all other artifacts related to how that job has been done in the past. So in a retrospective sense, we can go back and collect all these artifacts of how the job's being done, what the job is all about, and use that information then to analyze that job for the purpose of then position classification. Second strategy, we can use the use of questionnaires, providing highly detailed information about the job. Questionnaires obviously are sometimes open to measurement error, so we have to be very careful in how we craft those questionnaires to make sure we're asking the right questions in the right way, in the right sequencing, just like all the problems that we oftentimes encounter with doing survey-based research. Third strategy for a job analysis is interviewing. We can interview the incumbent in that position through either semi-structured or structured interview protocols to find out what the incumbent says they do in that job on a daily basis, how much time they spend on every function that they're doing. Also do interviews with a supervisor to see if we can correlate the responses of the incumbent with the responses of the supervisor. And then a fourth approach, which is used very frequently in job analysis, is observation. Observation is oftentimes used whenever we're doing a reclassification of a position and there's some disagreement in terms of what the incumbent thinks the position is all about and what the supervisor, the organization, thinks the position is about. So we'll then do an observation. We'll actually go and watch the individuals perform their actual job duties on the daily basis. Obviously, this is not unobtrusive observation. They know they're being observed, and so you introduce the methodological problem of the Hawthorne effect. The way people usually react differently when they are being watched, that could lead to some measurement error doing observation. But again, observation, this fourth approach to job analysis, is typically done if there is some disagreement in terms of what the nature and the duties of the job really is. That disagreement comes from the incumbent and the supervisor's view of that position. So again, there are benefits and drawbacks from each of those four data collection systems. It's always a good thing to try and combine approaches together. And we know that the more we can combine different approaches together, the more accurate measurement of our phenomena we can obtain. We can do what's called triangulation. So take the information from the questionnaire, the information from the interview, and the information from the archival data, and then by triangulating all that information, we can get the most accurate depiction of the job possible. We then take that information we get from that job analysis for each one of the positions in our organization, and we can then take that information and craft job descriptions and or position descriptions. So the big difference between a job description and a position description. In a job description, these are statements that codify the typical or average duties, level of responsibility, and general competencies and requirements of that particular job or that particular job class. A position description is a bit more specific. In a position description, it will be a statement that defines the specific and exact duties of that job, the exact levels of responsibility, and then we'll place that position within the organizational hierarchy of the organization. So it'll show you the specific position of that job within the other jobs in the organizational hierarchy. So a position description is oftentimes more specific and will provide you more information than just a traditional simple job description. So typically we usually use position descriptions, and in your work, you probably have a position description that describes your duties, will describe the level of responsibility, and give you an idea of the reporting mechanism in terms of where your position fits within the hierarchy of the organization. Now, in a traditional position description, we're going to provide a list of the essential functions and non-essential functions of the job. We're going to enumerate the physical, manual, and special requirements of doing that job. But in a traditional position description, there's not much of a mention of performance expectations. In more modern position descriptions, referred to as RODs, or results-oriented descriptions. In those results-oriented descriptions, we will include performance standards and expectations. So, for instance, for a clerical job, in a traditional type of position description, we may say types correspondence and leave it at that. That's an essential function. In a results-oriented description, we're going to go beyond that and we'll say types correspondence with an expectation of 70 words per minute with X amount of errors per page. So we're going to be very specific. The nice thing about a results-oriented description is it kind of bridges the gap between position descriptions and performance evaluations. So once you get to the performance evaluation phase, there are no surprises for the employee. The employee gets a performance evaluation that scores their performance lower than they had anticipated. They go right back and look at the expectations in their position description, and they should not be surprised. If they didn't meet those performance expectations, there's no surprise as to why they didn't get the glowing performance appraisal that they obviously were hoping for. So it really kind of eases the way toward doing performance evaluations. So how do you write these descriptions? Well, what are the different parts of a description? Well, first you'll start with a job summary. So it begins with the level of responsibility, identifies the department the position is located within, the level of supervision needed, and a list of the major duties in that position. We'll then break it down by the essential functions of the position, and listing specifically the essential functions of a position. That's very important for the purposes of ADA requirements. If you need to make reasonable accommodations, you need to know what are the essential functions of this job, because it's those essential functions that have to be done on a daily basis. An essential function is a function that constitutes more than 5% of the incumbent's time and is central to that position, to that job. Typically, most descriptions will have anywhere from 5 to 7 essential job functions listed. Could be fewer, could be more, but the rule of thumb is usually about 5 to 7 essential functions. We'll then include in there the physical and environmental standards required to perform those essential functions. So physical standards will articulate the exact abilities required to accomplish the job tasks as normally constituted. Again, here, the physical and the environmental standards will then contribute to the determination of reasonable accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act that can and should be made to some of these essential duties being done under these physical and these environmental standards. Environmental standards can include things such as the working conditions, how dangerous the conditions are, the requirement to work non-standard working hours. You think about if you were putting together a job analysis to then write a job description for a position such as patrol officer versus a position such as police chief. Well, you've got different environmental standards for those positions. The patrol officer is on the street, so the patrol officer is probably going to have more dangerous working conditions to work under than the police chief will have. And so this all goes into that job description. The minimum requirements and qualifications for the position will also be listed. The required KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, any special certifications, any degree requirements, any specific type of training that's required. You don't want to have excessive credentials listed here, because we require excessive credentials, then you could end up getting in trouble violating merit principles as well as equal employment opportunity legislation. So just the requirements in terms of what qualifications really are needed in order to do the essential functions of that job. So once we have our job analysis, and once we put this together into a position description, then we need to figure out where to put that job in our position management, our position classification system. And position classification systems are very useful for us because they provide us with control over the positions within our organizations. They allow us to manage and track and control employment numbers, costs, and levels and types of positions. They allow us to assign position numbers to different types of positions, assign different job locations, and most notably, to then assign compensation to these different positions within our position classification system. And that's one of the primary uses of a position classification system, so that we can assign the compensation for different jobs that makes sense given the work that's being done in each of those jobs. Again, allows us to abide by things like the Equal Pay Act and equal pay for equal work. So as we classify these positions, we are going to group these positions based upon similarities. And so again, we start with the duties and responsibilities of a single individual whose job is then called this position. We then have position classification. In position classification, we group positions together that have similar types of characteristics. Then we take similar classifications and group those similar classifications together into what we call class series. Then we'll take those class series that are similar and group those class series together into what we refer to as occupational families. Then we assign pay, we assign compensation, and we develop a schedule in which the grades, steps, and related pay are then determined, again, in cooperation and coordination with our collective bargaining agreements. But this is all being done for the purpose of comparing positions together, grouping similar positions in classifications, similar class series then into similar classifications in the class series, and then similar class series into what we call our occupational families. In order to be able to do this, in order to be able to know what positions are similar to what other positions and to know where those positions should fall in our position classification system, we need to move from the job analysis to the position description to a job evaluation. And the big difference between a job evaluation and a job analysis is a job analysis will deconstruct each individual job in the organization in isolation. A job evaluation will then compare positions to each other. So we'll compare that patrol officer job to a police chief job to try and then assign compensation by placing these positions in our position classification system in a grade and in a step. So when we do job evaluation in order to assign compensation, we want to be mindful of things such as equity. We want to make sure that we're ensuring internal equity, which is salary equity among all the members of our organization. But then we also want to try and ensure external equity, which is ensuring salary equity for those in similar positions outside the organization, so that people in a position in our organization not making a lot less than someone in the same position external to our organization. Because obviously, if we have much lower salaries, we're going to probably end up losing those employees to those other organizations. So we do this job evaluation basically to compare positions to each other. And oftentimes these job evaluations and job analyses are being done as part of a reclassification request. So employees can request a reclassification study if they feel that they're working outside their position description. So they feel that their job has changed so much that they're doing duties that are not within the original position description of their job. So they feel that their duties or responsibilities have expanded. So therefore, their job needs to be redesigned and needs to be reevaluated for different placement in the position classification system. So a reclassification study oftentimes triggers job analysis and job evaluation. The most common approach that we use in doing a job evaluation is what's called a point factor evaluation method. This is a very simple and very common way of doing a job evaluation. So essentially what we will do in a point factor method is we will identify all the different functions of the job, all the different duties of the job. We will identify things like the level of supervision that's required in that job. We will identify the qualifications that are required for that job. And then what we will do is we will assign point totals to each one of those elements of the job. So we will compare the patrol officer and their amount of supervision required to be a patrol officer to the amount of supervision required to be a police chief. Obviously, for the police chief, the amount of supervision required is going to be much higher. But then in terms of the safety of the job, obviously being police chief scores much lower on risk than the patrol officer. And so we will have to weight each of these aspects of the job. So is supervisory responsibility more important to us than the amount of risk that the incumbent in that job must deal with? Are qualifications more important than some other aspect of the job? So in a point factor evaluation, we will weight each aspect of our evaluation and we'll then assign points for each aspect of the evaluation for each one of those positions. At the end, once you take your points, you multiply them times the weighting, then you add all the points up. The total number of points for that police chief job will probably come out higher than the total number of points for that patrol officer job, which means the police chief job then gets placed higher in your position classification and will then get compensated at a higher level than your patrol officer position. So that's what's known as a point factor job evaluation, a relatively simple way of doing it. But again, there is some subjectivity involved. How you weight the different factors of the job will have a big impact upon your resulting score in your point factor job analysis. Now, a lot of organizations have tried to apply a more whole job methodology to try and replace the point factor type of job evaluation. In a whole job methodology approach, we're making much more simple summary judgments about the position. We don't systematically break the job down into its component parts like we would normally do with a job analysis and a job evaluation. In a whole job analysis, we basically look at past experience for the purposes of grading classification. In a whole job evaluation, we analyze the job in its entirety, and we assume summary judgments based upon past experience than for the purposes of compensation. So it's a more holistic, a more qualitative way of looking at positions as opposed to the quantitative approach of a point factor job evaluation. So up to this point with our discussion of position management, position classification, what we have done is we have recognized that a career civil service system is very much predicated on this idea of doing job analyses, job evaluations, and constructing a position classification system. The position classification system is there to try and promote equity. It's there to try and promote a focus on merit and qualifications, as opposed to having some type of arbitrary determination of compensation for positions. We do job analysis, an individual deconstruction of each job in isolation, use that information to construct position descriptions, and to then do a job evaluation whereby we can compare different positions to each other in order to create our job classification, our position classification system, and then to assign compensation to these different positions. Again, when you're doing this type of job analysis and job evaluation, the downside is that it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. So a lot of organizations are looking for more flexible, less hierarchical, and more entrepreneurial ways of creating their position classification systems. And so the movement in position management has really been a movement to decentralize and to make the assessment of these positions a bit more qualitative as compared to quantitative in nature. The other downside is that when you put together these job analyses and the job evaluations, that you have to update these all the time, that they become outdated very quickly. Organizations are always changing in order to address changes in their environment, which means the jobs within the organizations are changing as well. So we always have to update these job analyses and these job evaluations, and a lot of organizations don't. They'll do a reclassification study and spend a lot of time and a lot of money doing a reclassification study, and then they let it sit there then for a decade or so. And even though the positions are changing, the actual position classification system is not keeping up with those changes and becomes outdated relatively quickly. So this maintenance of your position classification system, this use of job analysis and job evaluation is something that should be an ongoing practice in the organization, or else you end up in a situation where you have all these reclassification requests that happen all at once, and you have too many reclassification requests for you to be able to handle in an efficient manner. And there's kind of this slippery slope too, that if one position, incumbents in one position ask for a reclassification study, and then their position gets reclassified to a higher level in the position classification system and therefore gets a higher salary bump, then other people in the organization are going to look to have reclassification done as well. And so it's kind of that domino effect that once a reclassification study is done for one position, reclassification studies typically get done for the majority of positions within the organization. But a position classification system is elemental to a career civil service system, and it's one of the most important functions of human resource management to be able to manage those positions so that you can ensure equal pay for equal work in your position classification system. Our second main topic for this week is employee engagement and employee motivation. And we need to recognize that in the HR literature, especially the public sector HR literature, this focus on motivation has really taken over a large portion of the literature. It's really become a major focus of the literature over the past couple of decades. So what is motivation? Motivation is oftentimes defined as being the driver energy that compels people to act toward achieving a goal. Another way to look at motivation is the willingness to put forth effort on a consistent basis for the achievement of a goal. So the important thing about motivation is it's putting forth that effort on a consistent basis and oftentimes being done to try and achieve a goal. So how do we motivate employees? How do we engage employees? If you're really interested in employee engagement, every single year, the federal government, the Office of Personnel Management, the Merit Systems Protection Board puts together a study on federal employee engagement. And in that study, they will have a survey that they give out to all employees of the federal government, spans every agency and department in the federal government, that will measure employee engagement. And will ask questions, such as how much they trust their leadership. We'll ask them, how much they enjoy their work, how willing they are to put in extra effort. And we'll use all these different motivational scales in order to try and determine how engaged federal employees are. And year after year, we find out that federal employees are more engaged in their jobs and more motivated in their jobs than we normally would think they would be. Public sector employee motivation levels tend to be a tad bit lower than in the private sector, but motivation and engagement levels in both the private as well as the public sector tend to be relatively high. And one theme that comes out of this federal employee engagement study every single year is that there is a strong correlation between employee engagement and the size of the organization that the employee works for. Employees who work in smaller organizations tend to report higher levels of engagement than employees who work in large organizations. And that's just kind of a maxim that is true year after year from this study. But it's the Federal Employee Engagement Study, again, produced by the Office of Personnel Management. They do it every single year. A really good insight into the motivation and engagement levels of federal employees. But we always want to try, obviously, engage and motivate our employees. And there are a lot of different theories out there in the literature for how to motivate your employees. We're not going to have the time and the ability in this class to go into all of those theories. We'll cover a few of them in this video, but you could teach an entire graduate level course on employee engagement in the public sector. But when we are motivating employees, the big dichotomy we oftentimes see is the dichotomy between internal and external motivators. And in our study of the public sector over many, many years, one thing that we have found is that public sector employees tend to respond more to internal motivators as opposed to external motivators. So an internal motivator is the feeling of self-actualization, as Abraham Maslow would tell us. It's the joy that you take and the satisfaction you take from doing a job well, from serving the public, from enhancing the lives of people in your community. Those are those intrinsic types of motivators. Clearly, extrinsic motivators are things more along the lines of salary or along the lines of recognition, external types of recognitions. And those external motivators tend to be more common in the private sector as opposed to the public sector. One of the reasons why we see more of a focus on internal motivation in the public sector is because we are much more limited in our ability to use bonus pay, pay for performance in the public sector as compared to in our private sector counterparts. So motivation is usually based upon some very common and well understood organizational theories. One theory that we predicate our understanding of employee motivation on is obviously Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. You're probably familiar with Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs. It's that pyramid whereby you have different levels of needs. And employees have different levels of needs, starting with your physiological needs. So people have needs for things such as shelter, such as food. There's a safety need in that people have a need to be safe and to have job security. Then a level up from that are the belongingness needs, kind of your social needs that people need to feel that they belong, that they're accepted by their peers and their supervisors. Next level up in the hierarchy, you have the need for self-esteem, that people respect you and that your peers and your coworkers hold you in high esteem, and that the apex of the hierarchy is self-actualization. Self-actualization is essentially being all that you can be. The kind of that army slogan that you've accomplished everything that you want to accomplish. That's why it refers to as self-actualization. That's the classical approach to Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. Later in life, Abraham Maslow changed up his hierarchy of needs a little bit, changed up that self-actualization and called it more contribution to society, and really saw it as not just really achieving everything you want to achieve, but being able to give back and contribute to the community, to society, and to future generations. The important distinction in these different needs is that the needs at the bottom of the hierarchy, the physiological, the safety needs, the social needs, those are what he called deficiency needs. That people are motivated by deficiencies in those needs. And so whenever there's a deficiency in those needs, they will be motivated to try and fill that deficiency. At the apex, you have self-actualization, which he refers to as a growth need. That's not a deficiency, but people are motivated by growth. They want to continue to try and self-actualize, and that growth need never stops. That's something that is lifelong, that will go on and on and on. Kind of like Chris Argyris, another organization theorist, referred to as his personal growth model, that people will always be pushed to continue to grow and to continue to try to be all that they can be. So the idea here with Maslow is appealing to the needs, knowing the needs of your individual employees and appealing to their individual needs will serve to motivate those employees. Another classic organization theory that motivation is predicated upon is Vroom's expectancy theory. And in Vroom's expectancy theory, he argues that effort or motivation is the function of several different characteristics. So he has his little motto where he says, the amount of effort that someone puts into a job will depend upon their belief that putting in that effort will let them achieve a certain level of performance. So the more they believe putting this effort in will lead to a level of performance, the more likely they are to put that effort in. That level of performance, once it is obtained, what's the likelihood that level of performance will then lead to an outcome? And then how much value do they place upon that outcome? So you kind of put it in concrete terms. Let's say that we're trying to understand the motivation of someone to work on a weekend to complete a project. Well, they'll be motivated to come in and work on that weekend to produce that project if they think coming in on the weekend will help them get that project done, will help them achieve that level of performance. And then if they achieve that level of performance, what's the likelihood that achieving that level of performance will result in an outcome, in a reward, such as being declared Employee of the Week? That's the reward that they're getting for getting this project done. And then how much value do they place upon that outcome of being declared Employee of the Week? So it's really based upon these percentages. So the more someone values, so the more someone believes that their effort will lead to a level of performance, the more likely they are to put that effort in. If that level of performance they believe will result in an outcome. So what's the likelihood that that level of performance will result in an outcome or a reward? And then what's the value that they place upon that outcome or that reward? So you have three major concepts in Vroom's expectancy theory. You have valence, you have expectancy, and you have instrumentality. Valence refers to the value that someone places on that outcome or that reward. So how much value do they place upon becoming Employee of the Week? Expectancy is their faith in themselves that if they put in this level of effort, they will accomplish a level of performance. So if they work on this weekend, how much do they believe that that extra work will lead to the completion of this project? That's expectancy. And then instrumentality is the likelihood that management and leadership will come through on that reward if a certain level of performance is achieved. So what's the likelihood that management or leadership will actually give them this Employee of the Week type of recognition? So in order for employees to be motivated, they need to value the potential rewards and outcomes that they're going to get. They need to have a high level of expectancy and trust in their own abilities to get the job done. And they also have to have a high level of trust in their leaders and their managers, that their leaders and managers will actually provide them with this reward, with this outcome, if that level of performance is achieved. So valence, expectancy, and instrumentality will all contribute to the motivation and the amount of effort that that employee is willing to put into that work. So the implication of this for leaders and managers is that it is imperative that leaders and managers know their individual employees, expectancy levels, know what their individual employees value, and then come through on their promises and make sure that they make good on the promises that they have given to their employees if they want to have a motivated workforce. Another organization theory that really contributes directly to employee motivation is Douglas McGregor. And you're probably familiar with Douglas McGregor, especially if you had the organization theory course in the past. Douglas McGregor is best known for his theory X and theory Y. Theory X approach to individual employees is that individual employees lack intrinsic motivation. They are lazy. They're not terribly creative. They don't want to work. They have to be told what to do. In order to get them to work, they have to be punished in order to increase motivation. Theory Y employees are just the opposite. They're creative, they're innovative. The desire to work is as common as the desire to play. They are able to self-govern, they're able to self-direct, they don't have to be micromanaged. Those are your theory Y types of employees. McGregor argues that the majority of employees are theory Y. Now, not all employees. There are some theory X employees in there, but the vast majority of employees are theory Y. Well, what's the problem? The problem is the majority of employees are theory Y, but they work in theory X organizations. And so you have this mismatch where you are shoehorning these theory Y employees into a classical theory X type of organization. So what's the upshot of this? In order to motivate your employees, you have to appeal to their theory Y motivations. You have to provide them with the opportunity to self-govern and self-direct, to build their own skills through professional development activities that they seek out and that they desire. You need to not micromanage. You need to delegate responsibilities to these individuals. You need to engage in what's called job enlargement that we had talked about earlier on. In job enlargement and job enrichment, where you are allowing them to take on other duties and other responsibilities that will help them develop as human resources. And so McGregor is much more about the job enrichment as opposed to just simply the job enlargement. So how you match these individuals, if you manage them more as theory Y individuals, they'll be better motivated to contribute to the goals and objectives of the organization. Management by objectives, which some of you may have lived through in your organization, another way in which you can motivate employees by laying out a clear path of doable, achievable types of goals. So you create some very achievable goals, and then you provide a path for achieving those goals. Management by objectives is really predicated on an organization theory known as the path goal theory, that you can motivate your employees by, again, working with them to establish achievable goals and then making clear a path for them in order to try and achieve those goals that they want to achieve. So the path would consist of things such as providing them the resources they need in order to do the job, providing them with the freedom to take chances and be creative in how they do the job, rewarding their accomplishments as they move down their path toward that goal. So MBO and this whole idea of the path goal theory, again, motivate your employees by helping them design goals and then providing the path and the resources for the achievement of those goals. One of the ironies with path goal theory is that sometimes you can motivate people more with difficult goals as compared to simple goals. And this goes back to a theory that we borrow from the world of physics known as field theory. And field theory argues that we're surrounded in this force field of all these different types of influences. And people are pushed in field theory to try and accomplish goals. And if there are unaccomplished tasks, they are motivated to put the effort in to try and accomplish those tasks, to try and accomplish their goal. And so this tension then makes people work harder, and this tension really leads them to higher levels of motivation. So what does the literature tell us about the drivers of employee engagement? And there are 8 primary drivers of employee engagement: supervisory support and encouragement, recognition, praise, and developmental feedback. Again, formative feedback is very important as compared to just summary feedback. role clarity and resource adequacy, supportive coworkers who are also committed to be doing high quality work and also committed to being high motivated employees. And that comes directly from Elton Mayo back in the world of organization theory and his Hawthorne studies. We know people work in groups, and you have a lot of this informal pressure that's placed from one member of the group onto the other in order to make all members of the group as motivated, as productive as possible. Having the opportunity to do what one knows best, again, allow them some self-governance and self-direction in coming up with their tasks and what they do on a daily basis, providing them with those opportunities to learn and grow, again, professional development opportunities, alignment, support, and belief in the mission or purpose of one's work, align individual goals with organizational goals. That's called goal congruence. And the more goal congruence in the organization, the more likely we are to have good employee engagement and motivated employees. And when people feel that their voices and their opinions are being heard. There are different types of leadership approaches. There's the participatory approach, there's the consultative approach. In the consultative approach, you are consulting with people. So you're allowing them to participate in the decision making, but they don't really get to act on those decisions. In the participatory approach, the participation they have in decision making has a real impact in that their decisions that they participate in, they're allowed to then be engaged in actually carrying out those decisions. So participatory management or leadership is oftentimes more effective for motivation than merely consultative approaches to dealing with your employees. One really important takeaway from the motivational literature is that there is no single factor or a magic bullet to employee engagement and motivation. Employee engagement and motivation is not as much of a science as it is a craft. It's not really a science because there's no one theory that we can apply in all these different situations. It's more of a craft in that there are a series of different approaches that we can use to motivate our employees. And so it's very contextual in nature, and it's a very complicated, complex thing to try and motivate your employees. We always ask the question about the role of money in motivation. Are people motivated by money? And we've already identified that in the public sector, external motivators such as money typically tend to not be as important as with our private sector counterparts. But there's a whole body of literature looking at the role of money in the motivation of employees. One person off the top of my head is James Perry. If you're really interested in the role of money in external motivation, read James Perry. And James Perry has a whole wealth of articles. Ed Kellogg is another person who also has a wealth of articles looking at the role of money. We know that we're very limited in the public sector in our ability to reward people and motivate them with external motivators such as money. We have tried bonus pay in the past with the senior executive service, and that was never fully funded. So that was, for lack of a better term, a flop. We do have some instances of pay for performance and merit pay in the public sector, but those tend to be very limited. And those often tend to be things that don't fare very well with public employee unions in the collective bargaining process. So since we are so limited in terms of those external motivators, we have to use more internal motivational strategies in order to energize and motivate our workers. The literature really lately has been looking at the different motivators and motivational strategies necessary for different generations of workers. And so how do you motivate a baby boomer as compared to how you motivate a Gen Xer or a millennial? How you motivate a baby boomer, these older, more mature workers, they tend to be more motivated by income. They're more motivated by the perks that they've been able to develop throughout their career. And they tend to really identify with their professions and with their organizations. They tend to be much more loyal to their organizations. This is a type of employee that Anthony Downs refers to as a conserver. So in Downs, he has his bureau ideologies, and one of those ideologies is that of conserver. They're the more mature, more veteran employees who are really very much loyal to their organization, and they're motivated by trying to hold on to the perks and the benefits that they have developed in their time in the organization. Younger employees, and I like we can refer to younger employees as Gen Xers and millennials. You typically now don't see a lot of Gen Xers considered to be younger employees, but especially with millennials, they are more motivated to move up in the organization and enjoy a good lifestyle. They're motivated more by that lifestyle component as opposed to money and status within the organization. They don't really view loyalty to their employers as a very wise strategy. Oftentimes, people from this generation really look at themselves as free agents and that they have a set of skills to offer to an organization and they can move from one organization to another relatively easily. It's important to keep them interested and keep them engaged in the organization with professional development opportunities and educational opportunities and the opportunity to move up in that organization. Downs refers to these employees as his climbers. His climbers are motivated by, again, professional development, by moving up in the organization, by having this better lifestyle. These climbers, if they see their path to moving up in the organization blocked, then they will jump to another organization because they're not nearly as loyal to the organization as a baby boomer may be, and their more veteran colleagues are. So, how we manage employees, we have to take into account their generational perspective as well. It's important for us to create this climate of motivation, opportunities for workers to find motivation at work through professional development activities and skill development activities, working one-on-one with employees to understand what motivates those employees and then respond accordingly to their specific motivators. So developing a climate of worker motivation consists of having competitive salaries and equitable salaries, relevant benefits, meaningful rewards and recognition for employees who achieve, opportunities for challenge and training and professional development, and friendly and cooperative workplace relations, all important bedrocks of a climate for motivation. Also important for a climate of motivation, assignments that allow for making meaningful contributions to society. Again, kind of more of an internal type of motivator. Feedback that provides recognition and opportunity for development, the importance of formative as compared to just summative feedback. Meaningful control over the work environment, self-direction and self-governance opportunities. Minimizing the demotivating effect of rules and regulations. One of the primary dysfunctions of a bureaucracy is overcompliance with rules and regulations. A lot of older, more complex organizations end up relying more upon the rules and regulations as opposed to trying to achieve the goals of individuals and the organization. And then reducing negative supervisory relationships, developing what we call positive dyadic relationships with employees. There's another body of literature that talks about the dyadic relationship between a supervisor and the supervisor's employee, that every relationship is a separate dyad. And so every manager, every leader has a different relationship with every single employee. And so if the manager has a lot of trust in that employee, they've worked with that employee in the past, they'll have a very strong dyadic relationship. If they don't trust the employee, they'll have a negative dyadic relationship. So working on all your dyadic relationships with the employees to make them as positive as possible. Feedback is obviously important in terms of evaluative feedback. Providing that formative feedback in the performance appraisal process is extremely important to get people to buy into the recommendations that are being provided to them so that if they are involved in the process of performance evaluation, they're more likely to accept the results of that process. So structuring feedback in a supportive way is important for motivating employees. Inadequate feedback obviously can be detrimental. A lack of feedback is frustrating for employees. If the feedback is too curt, it's seen as being disrespectful, which can be dysfunctional. Feedback really needs to be provided with good tact and well thought out feedback. Some people are obviously difficult to deal with and difficult to motivate in the organization. This is what was referred to in one theory as being the least preferred coworker model. And the least preferred coworker model, what you would have is you would have managers think about their least preferred coworker. So think about the person they would least like to work with as an employee, and then score that employee on a variety of different characteristics. Those managers who scored even their least preferred coworker highly are your high LPC types of managers, high least preferred coworker managers. Those who scored those people very low are your low LPC types of managers. So high LPC managers tend to develop good relationships even with difficult people to work with. Low LPC managers tend to struggle when trying to interact with their difficult employees. Difficult employees tend to try to avoid being disciplined through corrupting, compromising, and even blackmailing their supervisors. And so it's difficult to deal with some of these folks, but you have an entire organization that you have to work with to try and develop the highest LPC dyadic relationships as possible. Obviously, poor people management can lead to a lack of motivation among your employees. Some common mistakes in terms of people management, failing to get know your employees as individuals. It's important for us to, like Chester Barnard would tell us in the organization literature, to treat our individual employees as individuals, to realize that they have different wants, needs, and desires, and different things will motivate different employees. Failing to provide clear directions leads to a lot of frustration. Failing to trust, having these low LPC dyadic relationships can be problematic. Failing to listen, failing to get input before decisions are made, handing decisions down in a centralized top-down fashion does not get a lot of buy-in on the part of employees. Failing to react properly to a problem or a situation. How leaders react to a situation signals employees as to what is important and what is not important for those leaders. Trying to be friends with those who report to you, again, maintaining that distance in terms of employment versus friendship, failing to communicate and withholding information. A lot of leaders and managers look at information as being power. And so the more information they withhold, the more information they have, the more powerful they are. Not treating people equally, obviously a problem, and blaming employees rather than taking responsibility for when things go wrong. Being a leader means that you take responsibility for things, even if it's something that was done by an employee, so that the buck stops here. And I think that's an important thing for most leaders in terms of motivating their employees. So to wrap all this up, I know this has gone a little bit longer than we had originally intended, but know your individual employees. Each individual employee has different sets of wants, needs, and desires. People are motivated to pursue needs that are valued and feasible. So if you can know their needs and you can then motivate them by the needs that they place a high valence upon. Management styles of sticks and carrots are typically not enough. You have to help employees succeed and support intrinsic motivators. Intrinsic motivators by creating this climate of motivation that we had talked about, working one-on-one with employees, giving feedback, and developing these relationships. So again, we're just really hitting the high points and the tip of the iceberg with employee motivation. There is an entire body of literature on employee motivation if you're interested. A lot of different theories and a lot of different schools of thought. This just kind of gives you that tip of the iceberg within the parameters of a course on human resource management. Again, I hope this video was helpful, at least to clarify some of the terms you're getting in the resources that you're reading for this week. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a good week, and I look forward to talking to you again next week in our week 4 video.